Welcome, folks. In another Myths show, World War II TV regular guest Dave Holland from Walking Guadalcanal is here to talk about did the US Marine Navy abandon the Marines? I'll bring him in now. Good evening, Dave. How are you?
I'm doing well, and thanks again for having me on. So
this is the big one.
This
is the one that is the most discussed. It's the most repeated. The US Navy just simply abandoned the Marines, their faith on Guadalcanal. So I'm going to kind of hand it over to you. I'll try and keep the slides in conjunction with what you're saying. Folks, we might have a time for a couple of questions at the end of this, but basically I'm going to hand over to Dave to take us through this story. So over to you, sir.
Thanks, Woody. All right, so the U.S. Navy abandoned the Marines of Guadalcanal. That's the topic, and I think for those who are not familiar with the Guadalcanal campaign, if you was to read that, U.S. Navy abandoned the Marines of Guadalcanal, you would think, okay, the Navy left. Abandon. What does abandon mean? It's basically to leave a person, place, or thing, generally forever. But if you have a bit of knowledge about Guadalcanal, you could probably narrow it down to one day in specific, which is the 9th of August, with the air cover leaving and the supplies being half loaded. And then a few weeks after that. But is it a myth? I think I need to do a bit of a background before we hit that. So maybe to keep your listeners a bit watching a bit. If not, you can just fast forward after it's recorded. So myself, I'm a former U.S. Marine. I had 8 years in the Marine Corps. And when I went to Parris Island, South Carolina, which is the Marine recruit depot, my favorite subject, other than food and sleeping, was Marine Corps history. Because Marines are big on the history and teaching the past. And I still remember when we reached the battle or the campaign in Guadalcanal, they mentioned, yeah, and the Navy left the Marines, just left them high and dry on the beach. They bugged out. They just chickened and ran. And that's what the Navy did. They just left the poor Marines to defend the island and fight on, you know. And that was it. There was no other discussion about it. And then we went on to the next subject. And throughout my times in the Marine Corps, it was always the kind of a joke. Oh yeah, we'll be ever an invasion, but you're gonna watch the Navy. They'll just leave your butt. We said other words, but yeah, they will leave you. And I just took it, for granted. Yeah, whatever. And then once I went to Guadalcanal, and obviously I started doing a lot of research. And there was one fact that I read one time, and it really it kind of shocked me, that killed in action with the casualties on Guadalcanal, there was 1,600 ground casualties between U.S. Army and U.S. Marines in a 6-month campaign. There was 5,500 Navy casualties in a 6-month campaign. So every 3 Navy, U.S. Navy and Australian, who died in the mainly around Guadalcanal, 1 person died on land. So I'm thinking, hold on a minute. If the Navy abandoned the Marines, that can't be true. Not with that casualty. And plus, I knew it was 25 warships sunk by the U.S. and over 25 for the Japanese. So there was some intensive combat. So maybe this isn't correct. Is what I've been like. I was trained by old Vietnam vets. Most of my senior NCOs and senior officers are Vietnam vets, and I'd imagine they'd been trained by their senior officers, and their senior vets was World War II vets, and probably some were actually Guadalcanal vets. So that cultural passing on, that cultural myth, I wouldn't say myth, but knowledge, just kept passing on and on and on. So it stuck. And then, and if you read a lot of the histories right after the war, and these official histories, that information still stuck. So what I've gathered, what I've come up with, it's a myth and a controversy all in one. And it's probably the largest controversy you'll find, and probably one of the largest ones in the Pacific War. And it involves around one man, right? And that's Blackjack Fletcher. Now, in saying this, we don't have time to focus on the controversy in Blackjack Fletcher, because that could be a whole series in itself, right? But I'll have to bring in Fletcher because it sets the context for the myth or not myth, right? So Ian Towe, some of you viewers would know Ian Towe is a Pacific War naval historian, basically said this subject has been parsed, scrutinized, and debated by generations of historians. Just this subject alone, that the Navy abandoned the Marines at Guadalcanal. And the controversy mainly revolving around Frank Blackjack Fletcher, Vice Admiral. So I'll give a quick background to set the stage, because we'll have to go into it to get the context. So after the Battle of Midway, that kind of set the stage, that allowed the Americans to go on the offensive, right? And Admiral King, which is the Chief of Naval Operations, it always had the plan to actually go on the offensive in the Pacific, a limited offensive. So this kind of gave him the push to do it. So I won't go into too much background on that with the Marshall and the Europe First policy, because once again, I'm trying to tip the edge of the waves here. So he was given the green light by the Joint Chief of Staff to commence an offensive. And the offensive would be in 3 phases called Operation Pestilence. The first phase would be the seizure of Tulagi, Santa Cruz Island, and the surrounding islands around Tulagi. The second phase would be the seizure of other islands in the Solomons, plus some areas in New Guinea. And the third phase would be the isolation and reduction of Rabaul, right? So the first phase would be under U.S. Navy control, and the other 2 phases would be under Douglas MacArthur and the Southwest Pacific control. So phase 1, that's what we're talking about here. So phase 1, the tactical commander, the overall commander, so I'll say the strategic commander, was a guy by the name of Robert Gormley. I think you have a photo of him.
Yep.
And Gormley was named the South Pacific commander, and there he is on the right, Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley. Robert Lee Gormley was his name. So Gormley was appointed the operational commander for this phase 1. Another person who was nominated would be the Expeditionary Force commander, was Fletcher. He was nominated by Nimitz, and Nimitz was the admiral and head of the Pacific. So now at the time, Fletcher was in Hawaii, and Fletcher was commander of a number of carriers, 3 aircraft carriers at the time. So New Zealand at that stage had the 1st Marine Division. They just arrived in New Zealand. They're only there for a couple of weeks when Alexander Vandergriff, who was the 1st Marine Division commander, was called on to see Gormley. And Gormley says, we've got an operation and we're going to take Tulagi. And by that stage, Guadalcanal wasn't known at that stage. We're going to take Tulagi and the surrounding islands. I want you to formulate a plan. So once again, I'm trying not to get too deep into this. So he formulated the plan. Then you had a guy there called Turner. So Richmond Kelly Turner, which is the guy in the foreground there, and you had Vandergriff behind him. He was the amphibious force commander, and Vandergriff was the landing force commander. So he answered actually to Turner there. So Turner, his force hadn't even started getting a plan together yet, because he wasn't on scene. So you've got Fletcher. He's coming from Pearl Harbor. He's in radio silence. So he's not formulating a plan either. The only people formulating a plan at this stage was the 1st Marine Division. So the planning. Generally with planning, you can imagine, this was the largest U.S. invasion in its history. Obviously, it was surpassed by other invasions throughout the war. But at this time, this was the largest U.S. invasion and the strongest, most powerful in U.S. History up to that date, right? They called it Operation Watchtower, but I think everyone known it now as Operation Shoestring. Admiral King, this is quite funny actually, he actually wrote down, because of the urgency of the seizing and occupying Guadalcanal, planning was not up to the usual standard. right? So there was no time for the normal detailed planning stage. So everything had to be done kind of on the fly. So they started coming up with a plan. Normally, the amphibious force commander comes up with his plan. The landing force commander piggybacks on his plan, but they had to do it reverse. So the first Marines come up with their plan, first Marine Division, and then Turner had to piggyback on his, right? So they come up with a plan. Actual Gormley wasn't involved in the planning, and he was the operational commander. They actually went down to a place called Coro in the off Fiji and one islands to do rehearsals. That was when all these task forces were going to meet off Coro in July. So this is the first time that your expeditionary force commander had actually met the other elements, which would be Turner. You had John McCain, Slew McCain, which is the Senator John McCain's grandfather. You had Vandergrift, and you had a number of other, and Fletcher, and you had a number of others involved there. So they met on board the Saratoga, which is the flagship of Fletcher. And then this is the first time they've ever come together. Now, Fletcher opened the meeting up, and some of these notes, no one actually took any notes, official notes. A guy called Callahan was the chief of staff of Gormley. He was there. And I'll get to Gormley's absent here in a second, which is very, very important. So he was the one that took some notes. He was the only one. So apparently there was a heated discussions between Fletcher and Turner, because Fletcher had actually only, I think, picked up Vice Admiral 3 or 4 days before this. So he threw his third star on about 3 or 4 days before this. So apparently there was heated discussion between both of them. Fletcher basically came in. He wasn't happy with the operation. He says it wasn't enough planning done. You know, who's come up with this idea? Something you probably don't want to hear from your overall commander. It's kind of defeatism, so to speak, if you take it from the Eastern Front. So it's probably not setting a good look for the rest of the staff. So the biggest bone of contention, this was the thing that really revolves around everything about this myth, is the air cover and the time that they're going to provide air cover for the transports and the cargo ships offloading. Now, Fletcher basically said, look, I'm concerned about land-based air, and I'm concerned about submarines, right? I've got these 3 carriers, and I can't afford to keep them off and subject to assault by these forces. So they're only going to be there for 2 days. So D plus 1. And obviously you can imagine what Turner and Vandergrift, as soon as they heard this, they said, there's no way we're going to get our cargo ships unloaded in that time. Turner said 4 to 5 days. Vandergrift said 5 days plus. And it went back and forth, and they couldn't reach a conclusion. And finally, Fletcher, who Vandergrift in his memoir said he was nervous and tired, basically said, okay, I'll give you 3 days, and that's it. And he walked out, and that was the end. And in fact, it goes back to planning. They didn't even have enough operational plans that Fletcher came up with. They didn't have enough operational plans to even go away around for that meeting. Now, let's get back to Gormley. This is very, very important for this. So Gormley wasn't present at this meeting, right? Gormley wasn't present to be the referee, so to speak, and make that final decision.
Right.
And there's a lot of elements to that. And like I said, we don't have that much time to go into it and why that was. But it's very important. I'm cutting us over time to get to the actual myth. Admiral Swift, Scott Swift, U.S. Navy retired, wrote in the Naval Institute this month, January 2024, right? And there you go. And he was writing on the modern day Pacific. When the plan is flawed or planning assumptions are proven to be false, those who would have managed the plan's execution must now lead to adjust it, change, or even abandon the plan based on emergent realities. So Callahan was there, chief of staff, but the main person who could make that decision, Gormley, was not present. So everyone left that Coro conference not happy, but that was where it's going to be, right? So this becomes very important in the myth. Fletcher has already stated, look, I'll give you D plus 2, so 3 days.
Yeah.
So the morning of the 9th of August, he says, I'm out of there. I'm out of there. And he made it perfectly clear. So everyone knew that was going to be the plan. And this is very important, what the notes that Callahan wrote down, which you don't find this in a lot of histories. So Callahan, the chief of staff, the only one that took any notes, but they weren't official notes, there's no one taking minutes in this one, said, he added that the cargo ships, which might need 3 or 4 days to unload, were to be anchored as nearest to the shore as possible. Rear Admiral Victor A.C. Crutchley's Task Force 44, which is 3 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 9 destroyers, would remain behind to screen them. Turner's Task Force 62, op plan dated 30th of July, reflected these arrangements to remove all the amphibious forces by the end of the 2nd day of the landing. Right. So the plan was, because obviously you can unload transports very quickly. Well, I won't say very quickly, but you got mainly troops in there.
Yep.
5 main cargo ships. You got to remember too, these things were packed. They were combat loaded, but they had to really cut down on weight. So they were going in with the bare minimums. I mean, every Marine only had his 1 set of uniforms, and that's it. There's no tents. I mean, I've got all the manifest list. All that was left behind. They had 10 units of fire, and I'll discuss in a minute what a unit of fire is, and 60 days worth of food. So they're all left there. They're not happy, but that was the plan. They already set the plan out. So you got to keep that in your mind. This was the plan. And just to show you too how it's Operation Shoestring, I said Operation Shoestring with the commanders. When I talk about the operation orders that Fletcher had, it didn't have enough to hand around. The actual commander of the whole operation, Gormley, didn't receive the operation orders till 3 weeks after the invasion. So, okay, equate it to D-Day, which I'm just saying, say Gormley is what? Eisenhower. And say Fletcher is Montgomery. Imagine Montgomery not giving his plan to Eisenhower until 3 weeks after the invasion.
Yeah.
It's ludicrous the way you do it. Once again, it was 45 days from the time King said, I want this done, till they hit the beach. So Operation Shoestring. So the invasion. Once again, I'm trying to keep it above waves a bit. So the invasion day was 7 August 1942. And obviously, yep, there's a good map. So you had split in 2 forces. So you had about 11,000 Marines hit Beach Red or Red Beach on Guadalcanal, and the remaining Marines went up to the Florida Islands, Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanabogo. And basically, the invasion was unopposed on Guadalcanal, but it was opposed on Tulagi. So you can go back to other videos that I've done and others have done to want to get an in-depth look on that. Now, unloading issues, and we'll discuss this. So obviously, this was the very first time this happened in the war, right? It's the very first amphibious invasion, very first largest amphibious invasion since Gallipoli. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned here. They were operating under the Marine Corps Amphibious Tentative Doctrine in 1934. So the plans was there. This is a good indication of how Beach Red looked on end of the first day. As they say in Australia, it looks like a cluster. And it was just stuff everywhere. So it was unorganized. Some examples. They had a beachmaster, right? He was trying to organize people to do things, but it just wasn't that well organized. And you can notice too, they only had a limited amount of beach. There's no docks to unload, right? The ships, they only had the little boats to move back and stuff forward, and they had to rely on a lot of manpower. Vandergrift had the 1st Pioneer Battalion, which is like combat engineers. He had them earmarked to unload cargo. There's only about 350 to 400 of them. So they were trying their best. Also, in the manual, it says that the beachmaster can, in conjunction with the unit commander of a unit, basically pull some of his troops off to assist in the loading. So you can imagine how that went. There were stories how the beachmaster was very frustrated with the Marines, some of the Navy guys. They're trying to get the Marines to help them. The Marine infantry guys, they're sitting underneath knocking down coconuts, just sitting around. He said, we need help. And they said, we're infantry guys. We're not unloaders, we're not stevedores, we're not going to help you. So little things like that. So the unloading wasn't going to plan. They were doing the best they could. And then the unloading at Tulagi couldn't occur because they were still fighting on Tulagi for 2 days, up to 3 days, Tulagi and Gavutu and Tanabogo. So this cargo wouldn't be unloaded on Tulagi. So when all this is happening is too, they didn't have really great communications with Gormley, right? Because even in today's environment in the Pacific, it was thousands of miles. Even with SATCOM, you're still going to have some issues. In those days, it was high frequency or HF, atmospheric, works on atmospheric conditions and things like that. That's a whole science in itself. But they were having issues. So they didn't have any, Gormley didn't even know what was going on. So that's why Fletcher, which is good, they decentralized the command, and he had the commander's intent. So he was a combat, a leader. He actually led the Coral Sea in Midway battles. So they had confidence in him making a decision. So the Japanese, as expected, they responded very quickly and hard and fast, or fast and violent, as Vandergrift said. So they, over the 2 days, they had 3 major air assaults involving over 92 planes over 2 days. So Fletcher's carriers were providing cover and fire, combat air support with the Wildcats and the Zeros. They were taking a toll on both sides. But for example, the Wildcats, you lose half the Wildcats in 1 day. Half of the CAS got shot down. As you know, in carrier warfare, the CAS are actually very, very important. If you don't have CAS, you can that's it. But over 2 days, the crews were, I think I read that there's some of the busiest 2 days of any carrier cruise in a war. I don't know if that's true, but they were really, really working hard because they was doing close air support, CAS. They were doing reconnaissance. They were very busy working with these 3 carriers, and they're rotating on the southeastern part of Guadalcanal, about 12 miles out. So now, this happened over 2 days. Now we'll get to the point where we're coming to the night of the 8th, the Battle of Savo Island. So right before the Battle of Savo Island, and once again, I think this has already been covered, which is the greatest surface defeat in U.S. Navy history. Mm-hmm. So right before the battle happened, and still it's a controversy to this day why the communications between Fletcher and Turner, I couldn't find and no one really knows a direct answer to that, why that did not occur. But what Fletcher did, he radioed back to Gormley, he had radio comms then, asking permission to withdraw. Not withdraw back to New Caledonia, not withdraw back to the United States like some people think, but withdraw a bit further, about 25, 30, 40 miles out, right, to get away from potential land-based air and submarine, because you don't want to keep carriers in a stationary air position. So he started moving out, not to fully go out. If he didn't receive permission from Gormley, he was going to hook back in and provide more air cover on the morning of the night. But anyway, that radio message got intercepted by Turner's radio guys. So he's told Turner, or they told Turner, that Turner's called a emergency conference on a Macaulay, which is a ship. He's called Crutchley, which is Royal. I don't know if you know about him, Vice Admiral Crutchley. He had a VC. He was on loan to the Australian Navy. So he called Crutchley and Vandergrift, and he says, look, Fletcher's pulled out, and we need to discuss what we're going to do in the morning. He says, well, I'll keep my transports here as long as I can. We'll be pulling out in the morning, and then my cargo ships I'll keep them there to the end of the day. So this is all what was originally planned anyway.
Yeah.
To start with in the Coral Conference. Anyway, the Battle of Savo Island came, largest defeat. Next morning, so I'll take it one step back. Fletcher had received permission from Gormley then to withdraw. He said, look, we're running out of fuel. My plane's been taking a hard hit. Once again, that's all controversy. I'm trying not to get into that. And then he withdrew. He didn't even know the Battle of Savo Island had actually occurred, apparently. So the next day, they kept their transports, and there's hardly any covering ships. They're at the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound, and they pulled out. And then later in the day, the cargo ships pulled out. They unloaded as much as they could. Now, when they're going to the myth, yes or no? Finally. All right. Yes, it is a myth. The U.S. Navy did not abandon the Marines at Guadalcanal, and this is the reasons why. It's unfair to say it was abandonment, bugging, or cutting out. It's not an accurate reflection to say that because it sounds cowardly.
Yep.
I think it's a dishonor to especially the sailors who fought and died there. And I was speaking to a sailor vet one time, and he said that really hurt him to hear that oh, you guys just bugged out. You didn't do anything at Guadalcanal. You chickened out, which is not wrong, not right at all. Once again, the Navy was actually leaving as planned. Right? They were leaving as planned. It was already discussed at Coral. They were leaving. So Fletcher wasn't holding anything back. He did exactly what he was going to say. So obviously, and once again, he can't get in. I don't want to get into that because it's a whole controversy, reasons why, because there's a lot of reasons why. Whether you agree or disagree on that, that's a controversy, and that's mainly involved in Fletcher, right? And he had a lot of things over his head, and if you look at potentially, he was justified in doing it, and it later panned out that what he did was correct. Now, what was, I guess, the Marines expected, or what was expected for those transports to do? To remain there? And how good would the cargo be at the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound?
Yeah.
Right? That wouldn't be good to anyone. So at least they withdrew, and they came back 3 or 4 weeks later in that. But I'll get to that in a second. So when Turner on that conference, he's told Vandergriff, he says, I'll be back every week. I'll resupply you every week, right? The Navy returned 4 days later. They returned 4 days later when the APDs, which is little fast transport destroyers, they returned 4 days later, right, with supplies. Obviously not going to supply a whole division, but they returned, and they did a number of trips backwards and forwards. In fact, these little APDs, which the Raiders, are going to see, some of the Raiders won't say that these Navy guys abandoned them because they love those APDs. In fact, there was 2 of those APDs, just put things in perspective, 2 of those APDs at one night took on a superior force of Japanese destroyers. Both of them were sunk. More sailors died that night than did in 2 days of Bloody Ridge. But you don't know anything about these 2 sailors, do you? No one knows about these guys. So that puts things in perspective. There's different versions you'll hear over the years, people finger pointing left and right. I mean, say, for example, Turner, are you going to be the admiral responsible for the greatest defeat in history? No. So a lot of times finger pointing this guy. So the Navy was pointing fingers at the Marines pointing fingers at the Navy. One thing I will mention real quick, the Marines' perception, which is very, very important. So with all this, a lot of this originated from. Well, they justified in thinking that the Navy abandoned them that night. Yes, they were justified, more than justified, right? The Marines felt shocked and frustrated. They felt abandoned and isolated. Now, I'll read you something out of the history of the 1st Marine Division at Oldbury, or McMillan, real quick. The feeling of exponentially, sorry, I can't even talk. Throat. The feeling of being expendable is difficult to define. It is loneliness. It is a feeling of being abandoned. And it's somewhat more to, it is events over which you have no control that put a ridiculously low price tag on your life. When word got around Guadalcanal in the 2nd week of August that the Navy had taken off and left the Marines, the feeling of being expendable became a factor in the battle. I know I had a feeling, says a man who was there. I think a lot of others felt the same way, that we'd never get off this damned island alive. Nobody said this out loud at the time. I was afraid to say it for fear it's come true. But, says the captain, there's an awful lot of talk about Bataan. Even as green as 2nd Lieutenant Division knew enough to understand an amphibious operation cannot be sustained without naval support. But the biggest thing at that time, you had a great leader. You had some great leaders in the 1st Marine Division, Vandergriff. He said, look, this is the way it is. We've got out a lot of our supplies. We got out 4 units of fire. That's the average amount of what a unit is expected to fire in one day. So that 4 good days of sustained fighting. And with the captured Japanese rations, they had 30 days of food. And they said, look, we're going to dig in. So they were expecting the Japanese do a massive counterattack. They had information from Rabaul that the Japanese had armor, and they were going to hit them straight on the Lunga Point. So that was the main focus that stage of the Marines, digging in and holding that airfield. And something else, you can't dislodge Marines by bombs. You got to land and take them out. They could hold there. They could hold there for a while until they could get some reinforcements. It ain't nice, but they could hold. The biggest thing, I think, the reason it's still sticking in Marines' minds over years, it goes against amphibious doctrine, that you have to support the landing force the whole time there, right? But once again, I'm not going to go into why Fletcher pulled out. There's reasons why. That's for another matter. Now the carriers, they didn't pull out entirely throughout the campaign. As long as they were there, they maintained an overwatch, right? A lot of the Marines on island didn't know the carriers are there, but they maintained an overwatch. And in fact, on the Battle of Eastern Solomons in late August, Fletcher had pulled out, got some more fuel, which he needed it or not, but he was topping up, knowing the Japanese would come down with their carriers too. And they had generally 4 carriers against his 3 carriers. So he ended up on an overwatch position at Battle of Eastern Solomons and stopping the Japanese transports. And then, I could get in the whole thing about the transports and the different types and until they get to the airfield operating. But now, obviously, it goes back to command. So Gormley wasn't a dynamic leader, wasn't an aggressive leader, right? And a good way indication of that is when Admiral Halsey took over on October the 20th. Yep. Look what he did. Anyone to say that the Navy abandoned Guadalcanal just has to look at what Halsey did. Everything he had, he threw it in. He threw everything they had. In fact, that last battle, when he had the battleships going in, that's all he had. He had nothing else. He had, and if that would have wiped out, that would have been all for what the U.S. Navy would have had in the South Pacific at that stage in that area. So he threw everything you could. And those guys fought battles. Look at the first naval battle of Guadalcanal on the 13th. They basically sacrificed themselves, that whole fleet, to take on battleships. They basically sacrificed themselves, and 2 admirals died, right, to keep those guys from bombarding that airfield. So they sacrificed themselves for it. But Gormley wouldn't commit for a number of reasons, and then he was replaced. But, just look at one thing someone told me one time, they said, if you think the Navy abandoned Guadalcanal on the 9th of August, there's a number of the primary striking ships plus 1,000 sailors still at their post at the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound from that night. Yeah. Never abandoned anyone. They're still there. Over 1,000 sailors died in less than 30 minutes. Over 1,000. So they're still on the bottom of that, still at the man in their post. They didn't abandon anyone. So they're still there. One thing, there's a guy called Marillet. He was a historian and a press officer, and he wrote a good book called The Island and later Guadalcanal Remembered. He says this, which you won't find in a lot of many accounts of this. And I'm a big believer in logistics, especially on Guadalcanal. Logistics. If you don't study logistics on Guadalcanal, you're not studying Guadalcanal. It's all about logistics, and this rings true. Marillat, Marine who was there the whole time. The main fault, it was at a stage in the war, much had to be done on a makeshift basis, was in grossly inadequate preparation for speedy logistical backup. The U.S. was simply not ready to support a major operation for the seizure, holding, and rapid development of an air and naval base open to heavy enemy counterattack. Important lessons in supply was learned in the Guadalcanal operation. So what he's basically saying is, even if they've unloaded everything they had, which wasn't that much, how are they going to resupply them? They hadn't really thought that through that much. In fact, in October, there was still logistical bottlenecks, because just reading when Nimitz and Halsey visits New Caledonia. It was a mess, logistical mess. It was a bottleneck. Same with the Army supposed to be coming in with garrison troops. It's just a big bottleneck. So even if that didn't occur, they would still have issues. But the Marines, being the Marines, they dug in. And then over the years too, you had the vets, and the vets would, as you know, you got a private soldier. He only knows what's happening in his squad. Maybe his his platoon. That's it. Some of these guys didn't even know the results of the Battle of Savo Island until after the war. I mean, the public didn't know until October due to a number of reasons. They want the Japanese to know how many ships was something. They knew how many had died, people had died, but they didn't know how many ships. They basically said it happened on 1 or 2 ships. So a lot of these guys didn't even know. They knew there was a battle, but they woke up and all the ships were gone, and but they knew there was a lot of the Navy had fought hard because they sent these young guys coming in, burnt and dying. So I'm conscious of time, so I'll just go over a couple other things. The casualty ships. So they took heavy losses. They had 2 aircraft carriers, the Wallis and Hornet, 5 U.S. and 1 Australian heavy cruiser, 2 light cruisers, 15 destroyers, and numerous other smaller vessels, plus extensive damage to many ships. 5,500 killed in action, over 700 wounded. That's U.S. Navy, and 84 Australians off the Canberra. So that's the sacrifice they did. And anyone that says that they abandoned the Marines just needs to read that casualty. And this last thing I'll say, from the U.S. Navy History and Heritage Command. During the brutal 6-month campaign, the U.S. Navy abandoned the U.S. Marines for a grand total of 4 days. Brackets. Yet the myth lives on. However, to the Corps' credit, they remember and venerate the extraordinary sacrifices and valor of the Marines who held that embattled, disease-ridden island against repeated Japanese attacks, while the U.S. Navy has largely forgotten the extraordinary sacrifice and valor of those sailors who enabled the Marines to hold fast. So I heard a person tell me one time, he said, on the misery scale, the Marines, there's no other division in U.S. that suffered misery-wise than the 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal.
Mm-hmm.
Killed in action-wise, U.S. Navy. So
yeah,
I could have went on for another hour or two, and especially
we'll bring you back. We'll bring you back. It's been an outstanding job, Dave, and I think it's all about perceptions and nuance, isn't it? It's
perception.
The Marines felt abandoned, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they were. No. And the fact that maybe at that point of the war, the US were overreaching slightly in what this operation was trying to achieve, and what they could achieve 2 years, 3 years down the line was very different. I mean, I'm saying the British and Commonwealth are doing exactly the same thing in North Africa, Mediterranean 42. They're kind of overreaching. They're trying to win back the war. The war's been going against them, and there's sometimes you learn by your mistakes, and you've taken us through it brilliantly. There is a couple of questions I'll deal with, and what Ian Carr is saying. The minutes of the meeting, the lack of information about that, does that suggest there's some kind of cover up or anything like that?
I wouldn't think so. I just think it's just another indication or an example of how unorganized it was. I mean, there was no control. Gormley had no control. You have to maintain control, and he had no control over it. And if it goes against the C3, C2, or C4 command and control principles that most modern military and emergency services do. I don't think it's a cover up. There definitely was after the Savo Island, there was a lot of finger pointing and blame, and people trying to get their way out of it.
And the people are saying about that this myth is kind of covered in the Pacific, the TV show as well, and which it is. But we will leave things there because we want people to go and watch this show. It's already been a bit longer, but it's been fantastic talking to you, Dave. It's morning for me, evening for you, folks. I've got 2 more shows in about 8 hours' time on World War II TV. We're talking about the French Army in 1940. And we're talking about various other things over the course of the week. But basically, thank you very much, Dave. Thank you for your questions, folks. I will see you all again. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying thank you very much for joining us. Cheers. Bye.
See you.